Every neighborhood has one. The person whose name alone makes grown adults sigh before they even finish the sentence. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Maple Hollow Estates, that person was Deborah Kessler. Deborah had been president of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association for 11 years, and in that time, she had turned a friendly little suburb into something closer to a military installation with mailboxes. Grass had to be mowed to exactly 2.5 inches. Holiday lights had to come down by January 3rd. Not the 4th, not the 5th, the 3rd. Trash cans could not be visible from the street for more than 4 hours before or after collection day. And if your mailbox post leaned even slightly to the left, you would find a bright pink violation notice taped to your door within 24 hours. The neighbors had a name for her, though never to her face. They called her the Colonel. Deborah didn't see herself that way, of course. In her mind, she was a guardian, a protector of property values, someone who cared, deeply and sincerely, about the appearance of a community that so many other people seemed content to let fall apart. She believed, with total conviction, that if she didn't hold the line, Maple Hollow would collapse into chaos, weeds creeping up through cracked driveways, faded paint peeling off shutters, dignity itself eroding one overgrown lawn at a time. What almost nobody in the neighborhood knew was that Deborah hadn't always been like this. Before she became the Colonel, before the clipboard and the laminated rulebook and the years of increasingly personal disputes with her neighbors, Deborah Kessler had grown up on a working farm 3 counties over. Her father, Walt, had run the place with an old red tractor that he treated like a member of the family. Deborah had learned to drive that tractor before she'd learned to ride a bike. She remembered sitting on her father's lap as a little girl, both hands on the wheel, weaving slightly crooked lines through the cornfield while he laughed and told her she was a natural. When Walt passed away 6 years ago, the farm was sold, the equipment scattered at auction to strangers. Deborah had kept exactly one thing, the tractor. It had sat in her garage ever since, half covered by a top, rusting quietly in the dark, a relic she couldn't bring herself to look at too closely because of what it reminded her of. Nobody at Maple Hollow Estates knew it existed. Which was, in its own strange way, kind of the point. The trouble that would eventually change everything started, as these things often do, over something small. It was late spring, and the Maple Hollow County Fair Committee had put up flyers around town announcing that year's fair would include a brand new category, the Antique and Working Tractor Exhibition, open to any resident of the county. There would be judging in several categories: Best Restoration, Best Original Condition, and the crowd favorite, the Tractor Pull, where machines competed to drag a weighted sled the farthest. Deborah saw the flyer while she was out delivering a violation notice to a man 3 streets over whose garden gnome collection had apparently exceeded the aesthetic guidelines for front yard ornamentation. She stood there for a long moment, notice still in hand, staring at the flyer stapled to the community bulletin board. Something in her chest tightened. She thought about the tractor under the top. She thought about her father's hands on the wheel next to hers. And for the first time in a long while, Deborah Kessler felt something that wasn't irritation or vigilance or duty. She felt longing. She decided, right there on the sidewalk, that she was going to enter it. Word got around fast in Maple Hollow, the way it always does in places where everyone knows everyone's business. And when people heard that Deborah Kessler, the woman who had once sent a certified letter over a birdbath, was planning to drag some old farm relic into the county fair, the reaction was not exactly warm. "She's probably going to enter it just so she can win and rub it in everyone's face," said Priya Anand, who lived 2 doors down and had once been fined for letting her recycling bin sit at the curb for 6 hours too long. Knowing her, she'll find a way to file a complaint against the fair itself if she doesn't win. Priya wasn't entirely wrong to be skeptical. She and Deborah had a long and complicated history. Priya ran a small at-home business restoring old furniture, and more than once, delivery trucks or customers' cars parked outside her house for pickups had triggered a wave of HOA warnings about unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone. The 2 women hadn't had a real conversation in over a year, only clipped exchanges through screen doors and increasingly formal letters. But there was one person in the neighborhood who didn't join in the gossip, an older man named Frank Delgado, who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac and had spent 30 years working as a mechanic before retiring. Frank had also butted heads with Deborah over the years, mostly about the old truck he kept in his driveway for parts, but he had a soft spot for anything with an engine, and when he heard through the grapevine that Deborah had an actual antique tractor sitting in her garage, his curiosity got the better of him. He knocked on her door on a Saturday morning, half expecting to be handed a violation notice just for showing up unannounced. "Heard you're entering something in the fair," Frank said when Deborah opened the door, arms crossed. Word travels fast, Deborah replied, wary. It's a small town, Deborah. Word always travels fast. Frank glanced past her toward the garage. Mind if I take a look? I used to work on farm equipment for a living, believe it or not. Deborah hesitated. She wasn't used to letting people into the parts of her life that weren't perfectly organized and presentable. But something about the way Frank asked, plainly, without judgment, made her step aside. The tractor, when Frank finally laid eyes on it under the fluorescent garage light, was in rougher shape than either of them had expected. The tires were cracked and half flat. The paint had faded to a dull, blotchy pink-orange, more rust than red. The engine hadn't turned over in years, and when Frank popped the hood, he let out a low whistle that wasn't entirely encouraging. This is a nice old machine, he said. But it's gonna need a lot of work if you want it running by fair time. Fair's only 10 weeks out. Deborah felt her stomach sink. 10 weeks had sounded like plenty of time when she signed up. Now, staring at corroded belts and a fuel line that had practically disintegrated, it felt impossibly short. I don't need it to win anything, she said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of it. I just want it running again. One more time. Frank studied her for a moment. There was something different in her voice than the clipped, official tone he was used to hearing from her at HOA meetings. This wasn't the Colonel talking. This was just a woman standing next to something that used to matter to her. Tell you what, Frank said. I've got some free time. And I know a few other folks around here who wouldn't mind getting their hands dirty on something like this. If you're willing to let people in your garage, I bet we can get her running. Deborah almost said no. Old habits, the instinct to control, to manage everything alone, to never owe anyone anything, pulled hard at her. But she thought again of her father's laugh, of small hands on a big wheel, and she nodded before she could talk herself out of it. All right, she said. Let's see what we can do. Word of the restoration project spread through Maple Hollow just as fast as the gossip had. Except this time, the story shifting slightly with each retelling wasn't about Deborah being petty. It was about Deborah Kessler, of all people, elbow deep in engine grease in her own garage on a Tuesday evening. A few curious neighbors wandered by that first week, mostly to see if the rumor was true. Among them was Priya, who had absolutely no intention of getting involved, but stopped on the sidewalk when she noticed the garage door open and Deborah, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, hands black with grime, struggling to loosen a stuck bolt on the tractor's undercarriage. You're doing it wrong, Priya called out before she could stop herself. She'd grown up helping her father in his auto shop back in Ohio, a fact almost nobody in Maple Hollow knew about her, the same way almost nobody had known about Deborah's father's farm. Deborah looked up, startled, wrench still in hand. For a second, the two women just stared at each other, two people with a long list of grievances between them, standing on opposite sides of an old, broken-down tractor. Wrong how? Deborah finally asked, and there was no edge in her voice. Just a tired, honest question. Priya walked over, crouched down, and showed her the trick. Angle the wrench differently. Use the leverage of the frame instead of muscling it straight on. The bolt gave way almost instantly. Huh, Deborah said, surprised. Yeah. Huh, Priya echoed, a small, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a truce. Not yet. But it was a start. Priya lingered a little longer that evening than she'd planned to, showing Deborah how to clean out a corroded fuel line without stripping the fitting. The two of them crouched side by side in the fading light of the garage. Neither one brought up the past, not the citations, not the terse exchanges through screen doors, not the year of silence between them. For the moment, it was easier to just talk about carburetors instead. Before she left, Priya paused at the end of the driveway and looked back at the tractor, half-stripped and surrounded by tools. You know, she said, I always figured you didn't actually like any. Deborah didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands on a rag, considering the question more seriously than Priya had probably expected her to. I think I convinced myself that caring about the neighborhood and caring about the people in it were two different things, Deborah finally said. I'm starting to think I had that backwards. Priya didn't say anything else. She just nodded, gave a small wave, and walked home. Over the following weeks, something began to shift in Maple Hollow that nobody quite expected. What had started as one woman's private, almost desperate attempt to reconnect with a memory of her father slowly turned into something the whole neighborhood found itself pulled into. Frank came by most evenings after dinner, walking Deborah through engine repairs with the patience of a man who genuinely loved the work. Priya started stopping by more often too, first to help with a stubborn part, then simply because she found she didn't mind the company. Even a few kids from the neighborhood, initially just curious about the strange machine taking shape in the Kessler garage, started showing up to help sand rust spots or hand tools back and forth, delighted by the greasy, hands-on project that felt like nothing else in their carefully manicured, rule-bound neighborhood. Deborah found herself, for the first time in over a decade, having conversations with her neighbors that weren't about property lines or violation notices. She learned that Frank's wife had passed away 5 years earlier and that fixing engines was, in some ways, how he kept himself steady. She learned that Priya's furniture business wasn't some rule-breaking annoyance but something she'd built from nothing after leaving an unhappy corporate job, restoring broken things into pieces people loved again. Not so different, really, from what they were all doing in that garage. And slowly, without ever announcing it, without ever calling a meeting or issuing a memo, Deborah began to loosen her grip on the neighborhood. She let a late trash can slide without a notice. She complimented a rebuilt flower bed instead of measuring its border height. It wasn't a transformation anyone could point to and name exactly, but people noticed. The tension in the air around Maple Hollow, so long and so familiar it had almost become part of the scenery, began, very quietly, to ease. That's not to say the project went smoothly. In the 5th week, a sudden, heavy storm rolled through the county, and Deborah woke to find that a section of the garage roof had leaked overnight, soaking one corner of the tractor and rusting a freshly cleaned part beyond saving. Standing in the doorway that morning, looking at the damage, she felt the old panic rising in her chest, the same tight, controlling anxiety that used to send her marching down the street with a clipboard at the first sign of disorder. She almost called the whole thing off right then. It would have been easy to decide the tractor simply wasn't meant to make it to the fair, to let it go back under its top and disappear into the garage the way it had for the 6 years before. But when Frank arrived that evening and saw her sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the water-stained engine block, he didn't offer sympathy so much as a solution. "Parts can be replaced," he said simply, pulling a folding chair up beside her. "That's the whole point of a machine like this. It's not precious because it's untouched. It's precious because somebody keeps deciding to fix it." He drove out the next morning to a salvage yard 2 counties over and came back with a replacement part that was close enough to make work, and by that weekend, with Priya's help sanding down the rust and 2 of the neighborhood kids repainting the corner that had taken the worst of the damage, Rosie was back on track. Deborah found, to her own surprise, that the setback hadn't discouraged her the way she expected. If anything, it made the whole project feel more real, less like a museum piece she was trying to preserve, and more like something alive that the whole street had decided, together, to keep going. By the 8th week, the tractor, Deborah had started calling it by its old name, Rosie, the same name her father had given it. "Your dad would be proud," Frank said, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "I hope so," Deborah said, voice thick. Fair Week arrived faster than anyone expected. The morning of the exhibition, half of Maple Hollow estates showed up at the fairgrounds, not because they had entries of their own, but because, somewhere along the way, Rosie the tractor had become something the whole street felt they had a stake in. The antique and working tractor exhibition drew a respectable crowd, filled with gleaming, professionally restored machines that had clearly been worked on by people who did this kind of thing for a living. Men and women with decades in tractor restoration, trailers worth more than some houses, paint jobs so glossy you could see your reflection in the hood. Standing among them, Rosie looked exactly like what she was, a decades-old machine lovingly, imperfectly brought back to life by a group of amateurs, a retired mechanic, a furniture restorer, and a handful of neighborhood kids who'd never held a wrench before that summer. Deborah felt a flicker of the old anxiety creep in, the same instinct that had once made her obsess over 2.5-inch grass. What if Rosie looked foolish next to these polished, professional entries? What if this whole thing had been a mistake? But then she looked around at the small crowd from her own street, Frank in his good flannel shirt, Priya with a proud, careful smile, the kids practically vibrating with excitement to see their tractor on display, and the anxiety quieted. Whatever happened next, this had already been worth it. Just before the judging began, a new problem nearly derailed the whole day. As Deborah went to start Rose's engine for a quick check, the tractor sputtered, coughed, and died completely, refusing to turn over again no matter how many times she tried. A ripple of concern passed through the Maple Hollow group gathered nearby. For a horrible moment, Deborah was convinced the morning's excitement had all been leading up to public humiliation, the tractor stalling out in front of judges and strangers alike, a fitting end to a summer she'd allowed herself to hope too much about. Frank was at her side in seconds, sleeves already rolled up. Priya held a flashlight steady over the engine while he checked the fuel line, then the spark plug, then finally traced the problem to a loose connection that had rattled free on the drive over. It took less than 10 minutes to fix, but it felt, to Deborah, like the longest 10 minutes of the summer. When the engine finally caught and rumbled back to life, the small crowd of neighbors let out a cheer loud enough to turn a few heads from the surrounding exhibits. "Guess she just wanted to make sure we earn it," Frank said, wiping grease from his hands with a grin. Deborah laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the kind she couldn't remember the last time she'd allowed herself in public. "Wouldn't be much of a story otherwise," she said. The judging took most of the afternoon. Deborah walked Rosie through her paces during the working demonstration, easing the old machine through a slow, careful lap around the exhibition ring while the judges took notes. She half expected to place somewhere near the bottom, if she placed at all. When the announcer finally stepped up to the microphone for the award ceremony, the crowd gathered close. The Best Original Condition award went to a beautifully preserved machine from a family who'd owned it for 3 generations without ever needing to touch the engine. The tractor pull trophy went to a heavily modified beast of a machine that dragged the sled nearly twice as far as its nearest competitor. Then came the category nobody in the Maple Hollow group had even thought to hope for, the Judge's Choice Award, given each year not for mechanical perfection, but for the entry with the most compelling story behind it. This year, the announcer said, the judges were especially moved by an entry that represented something a little different than what we usually see here, not a professional restoration, but a community coming together. This tractor was brought back from the edge of ruin by a group of neighbors, most of whom had never worked on an engine before this summer, in honor of a father and grandfather who once worked this very machine on his own farm. Deborah's breath caught. The Judge's Choice Award for this year's fair goes to Deborah Kessler, and her tractor, Rosie. For a moment, Deborah simply stood there, stunned, as the crowd from Maple Hollow erupted into cheers around her, louder and prouder than any polished trophy could have earned on its own. Frank clapped her on the back. Priya, to everyone's surprise including her own, pulled Deborah into a quick, fierce hug. Walking up to accept the small engraved plaque, Deborah found herself unexpectedly emotional in front of a crowd of strangers, something she never would have allowed herself even a season earlier. "This tractor belonged to my father," she said, voice unsteady but clear. "I didn't know, when I first put my name down for this, that fixing it would mean fixing a few other things too. My neighbors didn't have to help me. I haven't always made it easy for them to want to." She paused, glancing toward Frank and Priya in the crowd. "But they showed up anyway. And I think that says a lot more about them than it does about me." The results of that county fair rippled through Maple Hollow Estates in a way nobody, least of all Deborah, could have predicted. It wasn't that the HOA rules disappeared overnight, or that Deborah suddenly stopped caring about the appearance of the neighborhood she'd spent over a decade trying to protect. But something had cracked open in her that summer, and it didn't close back up. The violation notices grew fewer and gentler. Conversations at the mailbox lasted longer than they used to. The following spring, instead of another round of rulebook memos, Deborah organized the neighborhood's first ever community workday. Neighbors out on their driveways together, fixing fences, repainting mailbox posts, trading tools, and stories the way Frank and Priya and the kids had traded them in her garage the summer before. Priya's furniture business, once the subject of so many complaints, became something the neighborhood quietly took pride in. Deborah herself commissioned a restored dresser that had once belonged to her father, the twin of the tractor sitting proudly, freshly painted, in her driveway. Frank kept coming around on Tuesday evenings, not to fix anything in particular anymore, just for the company, and because the garage had become, without either of them quite planning it, a kind of second living room for half the street. As for Rosie, she never left Maple Hollow Estates again after that fair. Deborah kept her polished and running, parked proudly in the driveway every 4th of July, decorated with streamers by the same neighborhood kids who'd helped restore her, now a little taller, a little more confident with a wrench in their hands. 2 summers later, when the county fair announced it would bring back the tractor exhibition, Deborah didn't hesitate to sign up again. Not because she needed another plaque for the mantle, but because by then, the restoration project had quietly become an annual tradition on her street. That second year, it wasn't just Frank and Priya and a handful of curious kids gathered in her garage. Half the cul-de-sac showed up over the course of the summer at one point or another, some to help, some just to sit on lawn chairs in the driveway and talk while the work went on. A neighbor 2 streets over, who'd never said more than a passing hello to Deborah in the 11 years she'd lived there, brought over an old push-mower engine he'd always wanted someone to help him figure out. By August, Deborah's garage had become less of a workshop and more of a gathering place. the kind of spot people wandered toward on a warm evening without needing an invitation. Even the HOA newsletter, once filled with terse reminders about lawn height and holiday light deadlines, began to change. Deborah started a small new column at the bottom of each issue, something she called Fix It Fridays, where she'd list out whatever projects she or a neighbor happened to be tinkering with that week and invite anyone curious to stop by. It wasn't official HOA business. It didn't need to be. It was just an invitation, and in Maple Hollow, that turned out to be worth far more than any rule she'd ever enforced. People still called Deborah the Colonel sometimes, half in memory, half in affection, the way you might keep a nickname for someone even after they've grown past the reason it started. But it didn't carry quite the same sting it once had. Somewhere between the rust and the grease and the long, unlikely summer of fixing an old tractor, Deborah Kessler had found her way back, not just to a machine her father once loved, but to a version of herself she hadn't realized she'd lost. Looking back on it later, Deborah would say the strangest part wasn't winning the award, or even getting the engine to finally turn over after all those years of silence in the garage. The strangest part was realizing how much time she'd spent trying to force a neighborhood into order, when all it had ever really needed was a reason to come together. Rosie hadn't just been restored that summer. In her own quiet, rusted, sputtering way, she'd restored a whole street's worth of people who'd forgotten how good it felt to build something side by side. And in a neighborhood that had spent over a decade defined by rules, fines, and quiet resentment, that turned out to be the real result nobody in Maple Hollow Estates saw coming.